So basically, the reason why I wanted to talk more, of course, it would have been great to show the bioregion diversity of the fungi that are on the Sunshine Coast. But talking to Michelle, we decided to go into soils more as well, because it's such a rare opportunity to speak about soils. And fungi basically drive soil ecosystems on a major level. So perhaps I can do that or share that with you guys some other time. I do have this presentation ready as well, so I can just share it with Michelle, and she can share it with you, just about the beautiful biodiversity of fungi that is out there. You know, but this is a really important topic, and it's a hot topic and ties in right now with what Ian has presented and others have mentioned as well. So I will go straight into this phenomenon of soil and how fungi can restore soils for us. And you can see already there, I'm going to be talking about a lot of life in the soil, so get ready for that. So I'll just give a brief introduction. So we'll talk about history of soils and how they are formed, what soils are, soil carbon and how that ties in so perfectly with what's happening in the world right now, the root symbiotic fungi and their role in soil formation, the soil food web, soil destruction, and soil restoration. So let's begin. The Earth's history has been actually dominated by fungi. This is about 400 million years ago, when algae and fungi came out of the oceans. By the way, the ocean floor is filled with mycelium, which is fungi. They came together, they partnered up, and they created lichens, this symbiotic relationship that we still see today. Now, this is so crucial because photosynthesis and breakdown of minerals could occur simultaneously, dominating the Earth. Later on, giant fungi came out of the landscape called prototaxites, up to 10 meters long, or higher, I should say. And together, these fungal systems degraded rock into minerals and organic matter that was building up into minerals, creating what we now call soils, or first made soils. So what is this soil? It's actually a living thing. It is plants and associated microbes utilizing sand, silt, and clay. So the inorganic part of it is nothing without the microbes and the plants, actually, and without all the other creatures that make soil biodiversity. Has an essential function in storing carbon, so getting carbon out of the atmosphere and storing the carbon underground. It functions in production of biomass, obviously, and oxygen, both of which all of life is dependent on. We need oxygen to breathe, and we need biomass to feed on. Also, it hosts a ginormous amount of biodiversity. Largest biodiversity on Earth is actually under soil, but of course we know hardly anything about it. It stores and filters water as well, and it stores and cycles nutrients. This, I cannot say just how important this diagram is. Just in current, you know, this whole thing, global warming's happening, climate change. The beautiful part about it is that plants have dealt with carbon and the organisms with which they associate for, you know, billions of years potentially, so, or millions at least, since they come on Earth. So you've got this sunlight coming into a plant, and carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, or we pump into the atmosphere in other ways. Now add water into this, you have the photosynthesis happening, and this is a beautiful process which forms oxygen, which is a byproduct that we then breathe in, breathe out carbon dioxide, and have this symbiotic relationship with plants. Now this carbon that goes into the plant becomes carbohydrates. It's basically liquid sugar that the plant is creating, and it pumps it down to its roots. And there, this association, and I'll dump it right in there, it's called mycorrhizal fungi, myco meaning fungus, rhizal meaning root. This root extension of these fungi coming into contact with the smallest particles in the soil and feeding that sugar from the plant right down to the soil. Now, it is organically then bound, and the fungi, when they die off, they actually sequester that carbon and leave it there for potentially centuries and millennia underground. Other types of fungi called saprophytes or decomposers will also deal with the dead organic matter that drops down to the ground, and they'll decompose that. And of course, the symbiotic fungi of the roots will take those minerals and feed it back to the plant. So the plant is self-eating basically through these systems, which is wonderful. And that's where all the life is stuck in the living matter, not so much in the soil, but actually all of the minerals, everything that you want is stuck in the lives. And this is why we need the life. Otherwise, it just blows away with wind. So you take that further and further upwards. You've got this pinnacle, or what I call is like the pinnacle of biodiversity, is obviously rainforests. That's where most of the biodiversity is held on Earth. And of course, this is a giant network superorganism that is interconnected underground through these mycorrhizal or root symbiotic systems. So if we take some of those parts out, we lose that connectivity, which has been mentioned earlier. And plants basically communicate and share resources in this underground huge network of fungi. So this fungi root system exists in over 95% of plants. And you can see that the seedling here has tiny roots, but the rest of it is actually all this symbiotic relationship that it has. And you can see that the threads go thinner and thinner and thinner. So you can imagine that the amount of water it can access, and this is just a tiny seedling, the amount of nutrients it can access that a root can't do on its own. Now you can also see here that there are two baby seedlings next to the larger seedling in the middle on the left side there. And once again, see how they're hooking into that system. So babies survive, baby plants survive by actually getting fed by plants that can photosynthesize better, that are taller, and everything is hunky-dory because everyone feeds each other and lives like a happy family. So to take this a little further, one tree, mother tree, the avatar mother tree, has actually a relationship with 47 other trees of the same type, the same species, in just a small patch of forest that a study has been done on. So you can imagine if you multiply that by multi-species and multi-fungi, these are connected just by one type of fungi, then you have what we call the wood wide web, literally. So it's like an internet network underground that they're estimating it as having, per one person, there are 4 tons of mycelial mass underground. So it's ginormous, and we totally rely upon it for our own survival. Some other studies, obviously not in the Sunshine Coast, sorry guys, I'm relying on studies that have been published elsewhere, in this case, Northern Hemisphere, where the Douglas fir feeds the birch when the birch loses its leaves. So in systems where plants are either little and they can't fend for themselves, or waiting around for some light when the tree drops down, or go into torpor during the stasis part when they have no leaves, all the trees that can share their resources will share them underground. They'll feed those plants through this sharing network of mycorrhizal fungi. And I think it's so important to talk about soils because we know so little about them. I know I've said that, but that's just so exciting to be able to share it. So the same thing happens with climate change. So while the Douglas fir is now dying because it can't sustain its life in the warming climate, there are southern species of ponderosa pine coming through, and the Douglas fir is dumping all of its nutrients and sharing that through the mycorrhizal system and giving it to the newcomers. So while we might see it as a weed infestation, it's actually the forest trying to survive because we're changing the climate. And this is what happens. All these plants are communicating and talking to each other, and nature knows best. It shares its resources, and there will be a huge change in species diversity, and new species will come as a result of this. Someone mentioned earlier, we've got to cope with change. And this is one of the things I think it was Ian. So this wood wide web concept, it turns out, goes against scientific thought. It's not a competition, but a cooperative and equal distribution of resources within the community. And it is not survival of the fittest, but coexistence promoting biodiversity. And to me, that's like what we should do with our economy, where everything is shared, and the poor get looked after by the rich. Like, wouldn't that be wonderful? So just to zoom in on this concept of mycelium, I want to show it to you closer up on the root system. So all these individual cells you see wrapped around the root, they're called hyphae. So this is what they're so thin, you can't see them with the naked eye, but together they form the network of mycelium. So this is where you've got this dense network happening. And the essentiality of that is that the plant gives its carbon and sugar to the fungi, and the fungi are the natural fertilizers for eons, feeding phosphorus, nitrogen, and mineral elements and vitamins and things we can't even imagine yet to the plant. And this is how we get our nutrition and how animals stay healthy, because they get these nutrients. The moment we provide chemical nutrients to the plant, the fungus is lost. So in agriculture, we currently have hardly any of these, if any of these fungi existing, and natural systems potentially still do, but we haven't discovered that in Australia or our bioregion. So this is something I want to talk about at the end. So now you can see the carbon in the hyphae. On the left side, you've got this, the hyphae in the electron micrograph, and then the carbon labeled inside the hyphae, just so you know it's definitely there. And it's reported that up to 70% of roots and microorganisms hold all of that carbon. It's not in the wood, it's actually underground in the roots and microorganisms. And soil has 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere, and 4 times as much carbon as vegetation. So for me, that's a perfect resolution to how we can mitigate climate change. Hyphae also hold soil particles together. So once again, very, very small particles are held by these hyphal systems, gluing particles together. And this creates a wonderful biodiversity, because now there's air spaces between these particles. We have on this image here the root, and the green is lines coming off is actually the mycorrhizal fungal hyphae. The red bits are all the organic matter that is broken down by the saprophytic fungi, and then the rest is minerals. And of course, you know, there's life as well. So when you have a huge humus aggregate, when there's an aggregate that has humus in it, and I must say humus can only be created by these underground networks. You can't make it out of compost. It is actually made out of these gluey substances that fungi and bacteria secrete, creating these conglomerates of soil. And you can see the little nooks and crannies in that big aggregate where animals can actually live inside of. And what do we have? A huge amount of biodiversity. You have little mites and springtails and bacteria. It's ginormous, and we know hardly anything about it, and yet it's there and it's sustaining our lives. And when you see on the right image, we have these little pores created then by these aggregates. That's where little worms and earthworms and other things can kind of sit and sip water from and move around and defecate and feed the rest of the ecosystem and the plants. And you need that for aeration, and you also need it for water to be held in the ground. So I can't stress enough this soil food web concept, where you have the liquid carbon from the sun coming through the plant into your roots. The roots are then colonized with mycorrhizal fungi in healthy ecosystems, and the fungi then distribute that sugar, and that feeds the entire ecosystem. And as animals eat each other up the trophic levels, you then have this defecation of these minerals. Whatever they have enough for themselves, they'll poo out the rest, and the fungi then take it back to the plant, and there is your plant nutrition. So we're literally feeding on the waste products of the plants, as well as all the animals that are in the soil. And the more biodiverse that is, that will translate into biodiversity above ground, because all your animals can then feed off of that system. It's a wonderful system. I just want to introduce some of these guys. They're not fungi, and we'll go into fungi more, but there are millions of bacteria. We can't even understand how many there are, and they all look different if you magnify them enough, and they're really, really cool, and they do so many cool things. But there are also protozoa, which are unicellular organisms that you can see filter through, eat bacteria, and as they feed, they excrete nitrogen and other elements that then allow mycorrhizal fungi to feed the plants with. There are different types, and I'll go into this, but just note on the bottom on the left, less than 0.1% of soil organisms have been identified and described. So, you know, for someone like me, it's like a never-ending journey of discovery. We've also got nematodes, which are very microscopic worms you can see under the microscope if your soil's healthy, and that's a nematode egg. And of course, little, you know, alien-looking mites, but just as gorgeous as anything else, and just as prolific and just as essential for the ecosystem. And then springtails. So now we're getting into visible mode. Beautiful little creatures. I think there's one person that I actually know of that actually studies these guys. So once again, very little known in our soils in Australia. Such a shame. Look how cute they are. So I've heard and read, and I'm not sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a possibility that Australia was once a rainforest entirely connected by fungi. And in fact, in the Nullarbor, tree kangaroo bones have been found maybe even fossil, but I think they were actually bones. So very interesting to think about. And so they say that, you know, about 100 million years, there was this reign of the forest, of the rainforest, up until quite recently. And that apparently this forest was 10 times older than the Amazon, which is quite interesting too. Wow, you know, we are an old continent. And only 3% of that forest, of the rainforest, remains in patches. So we've got very little rainforest cover, and yet that's where our biodiversity lies. And we're lucky on the Sunshine Coast that there's still so much beauty, even though, as mentioned earlier, in very small patches remaining and disconnected. The sad thing is that, as Ian mentioned as well, that we are clearing the land at a very, very rapid rate. And in fact, Australia has the world's 5th highest rate of clearing. And that is responsible for 20% of our carbon emissions. 85% of clearing occurs in Queensland. And that's really heart-wrenching. So I looked at some of the government's websites to have a look what our soil is like in Queensland and Southeast Queensland, and we have poor soil quality. Of course we do, because as Ian mentioned, we have very, you know, even though we have some forest left, urbanization and heavy, intensive uses in the purple bits, you can see on the right as well. And of course, grazing, heavy grazing, it's not slow. And that's taking up majority of our region there. So, and currently, as of 2018, there's been a report showing that there are 27 million cattle and 71 million sheep on the landscape. So, and you know, 50% of that, or just the cattle in this case, are in Queensland. 50% of all the cattle graze are in Queensland. And I think it's like a conflict of interest, because 55% of Australia's rainforests are in Queensland, and 50% of all cattle are also in Queensland. So I'm like, well, what can we do? Like, this is not something we want for our generations to come, when we have to keep removing the soil and killing the soil through this process. So this, I think, shows why we have this large amounts of clearing, partly, and I know also urbanization and other things as well. And I'll tell you why that's a problem, because when we overgraze the landscape, we have then very small roots left. Giant fat root on the right, that's what's dragging the carbon underground and feeding all the soil microbes and other organisms that need to be there to produce more plants. So this cycle is now stopped. You know, heavy hooves impact the soil heavily, destroy the top soil, but also this heavy grazing prevents any native vegetation, any seeds that's left over to maybe in the future regenerate the landscape, is now getting grazed out as well. So we're losing topsoil as a result, and we might end up in this situation. This is already outback Queensland, where we have to rescue the cattle and the poor farmers because we have to deliver all the hay in drought periods. And basically we're forming deserts by intensifying agricultural processes. And it's just not just cattle. I'm an agricultural scientist, and I can blab on forever about what other methods we use that destroy our soil completely. But you know, the good news is we can reverse this. We can reverse this, and I have faith in this, because soil restoration with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi can happen. And I introduced the arbuscular part because look how cute. This is within a plant cell. You've got this tiny arbor, meaning tree, scule, meaning tiny little tree of hyphae growing inside colonizing a plant inside the cell and feeding it from within. So it's just a cute analogy there, a little tree within the system of a plant. So 80% of plants, probably more than that, actually have this relationship. The other ectomycorrhizal fungi are more associated with trees, and this is in an agricultural system I'm talking about. So we can reintroduce these fungi back to our systems, and they contribute up to 900 kilograms of soil carbon per hectare. This sequestration thing really gets me, because if we can change our systems, we can sequester carbon, cool the earth, create rain back again, and save our world. And just note that 1% increase in soil carbon removes 154 tons of carbon per hectare, carbon dioxide per hectare, and adds 144,000 liters of water into a hectare. This is staggering science, I feel. How do these guys do it? Well, on the left, we have this molecule only discovered by Sarah Wright, I think in the early 1990s, and it's called glomalin. It's this gluey goo that these mycorrhizal fungi agriculture release into the soil, and that gives soil structure, soil moisture. It holds on, it prevents erosion, it glues soil particles together, aerates the soil. There's endless gifts that this molecule gives, you know, it's a glycoprotein type of molecule. Now on the right side, we've got melanized endophytes, another type of fungi that also grows on roots, but it also sequesters carbon at 130 tons per hectare per decade, if we find them in the soil. Once again, both can be introduced into agricultural systems, and we have some sort of a great solution. So it restores degraded soils and polluted soils. I actually can't see what I'm looking at. Oh, that's all it was. Yeah, so there's a huge potential of restoration happening here. And we also have biomass and biodiversity production, of course, and stores and filters water, so we can clean up our waterways through this process by having healthy soil. And it offsets 1/3 of emissions as well. So you can see that annual emissions. I've just got you guys on the right here, so I can't see my slides fully. Whoops. Okay, so quickly, because I'm aware of the time, we have this system, if we plunk it into agriculture, this mycorrhizal fungi system, we can get rid of, we could provide this liquid carbon out to plants again. Also, the fixed nitrogen that's in the soil is then bioavailable to the plants, so we don't need any fertilizers anymore that are, by the way, made of fossil fuels. Every single mineral that we need, the plant will get from the soil biota through this mycorrhizal system. There will be huge soil carbon storage in these molecules I've mentioned, but also the formation of humus, which will last for up to millennia in the soil, slowly releasing this fertilizer as needed, and as it's building up as well at the same time. We have water delivery and efficiency to the plant, so drought resistance, and therefore less water use on agricultural systems. And of course, plant immunity. Healthy plants cannot be eaten by any pests, by any diseases. When a plant is healthy, there's no signal coming from a plant saying, eat me. So we have to move away from this ideal that things just are, you know, they're sick. At the moment, everything's sick. That's why it has no immunity, it has no resistance. When working in a biological system, and as all systems go, we have this potential to really have healthy diets as well. And of course, there are yield effects as well. So not only is the farmer now, you know, doesn't have to irrigate, doesn't have to do all these other things, put pesticides on the plants. Now they're growing bigger and better, and their root systems are healthier, and the yields increase. And why wouldn't we want to do it? I think it's a great opportunity now to know this. And at the same time, we can harvest it ourselves on our own farms. I'm working with a farmer currently trying to develop a way where we can do this. We can collect the spores and the fragments and hyphae from a healthy plant. We can grow that little plant in that potting mix containing those fragments, and we can grow the seed or seedling obviously in the pot first. And once we know by checking through microscopy what's going on in that root system, we can check whether, you know, it's taken up and then release that into the field. So now we have this inoculum for more plants in a nursery, while our plants are continuously living in this beautiful system. And of course that means changing our practices. And I looked towards agriculture as not only the problem, but obviously the huge solution that's potential, and also meaning that our entire ecosystem will change, not just the agricultural systems, but they will allow for biodiversity to crisscross from forests. So we would need no tilling, so no disruption of this. Remember I talked about this network underground? Well, every plant on earth has this networking happening. So no tilling, no lifting up and destruction of the soil. Have your mycorrhizal prep in your seeds or in your seedlings. Avoid any fertilizers because that will kill your fungi. And compost and composted manure is the only allowable addition. So you're cutting down costs considerably. And leave your residue on the ground, because that feeds your life forms as well. And that will potentially sequester up to 1,000 kilograms of hectare per year. Great study, that one, by Lal et al. So another even more endearing thing about this, and this is my last slide, I think pretty much, is that when you have biodiversity in any ecological system, when you grow your crops not as monocrops, but actually biodiverse, closely like a forest, mimicking the forest, you have this syntropic way of farming, and this is creating energy rather than dissipating it. And the plants just do that themselves. They just keep giving into the system. When this happens, you have this potential for crossover between basically growing a rainforest of food while the food, also the forest surrounding that area will also benefit, you know, because the flowers there'll be more flowers and things for pollinators. I can't imagine what it would look like if we started experimenting with farmers and doing this for the love of biodiversity and regeneration. Now, my last little bit here is that, you know, Woodfordia is a great example. It was one, I don't know if you guys know, but that's where the Woodford Folk Festival happens, where I work at the moment as an environmental projects officer. And we can have here on the left in 1988, a dairy farm. So the land has been farmed for a long time. There was some vegetation, but it was minimal. And then just last year in 2019 in the drought, there was a photo taken, and you can see, even though the land obviously is not fully a rainforest, there are patches of rainforest and connectivity created for biodiversity and also for humans to enjoy the festival and be under shade and camp under shade. And we're planting only endemic and native species to the area. The fungi that are coming back into the area are amazing, and I'm trying to document this biodiversity. So I know it's possible. And, you know, and just in 20 years to 30 years, you can have a forest back, you know, brimming with biodiversity. And I find that so exciting that people coming together can create these changes and actually increase that connectivity. So personally, I love it. And what I want to do is work with fungi and work with people. So there's a citizen science project I got a grant from the Queensland government for, and it's called the Mycology Research Project. And basically doing some of the things we've described, but creating nurseries, you know, collection of fungi, looking at what we have because we don't know. We have no idea what's there. There's obviously something because things are growing. Also, identification of these fungi. Can we look at them more deeply as scientists, you know, and even as citizen scientists, learning microscopy, learning how to identify.
Sandra, I hate to interrupt, but we're about 2 minutes over now, so.
Okay, great. Well, that's it. That's my last bit.
That's why I kept waiting. I thought you were wrapping up. Wonderful. You finish off.
Yep, so that's it, guys. I think I've got a thank you slide as well. Yep. If anyone wants to contact me, Sandra@woodfordia.com or Myco-Mania on Facebook, or just hit me up on Facebook by my crazy name. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks, guys, for listening. Bye.